All right. So we got a little bit interrupted there, but Ashley was patient enough as I worked out my internet issues. And so Ashley, you were saying something really interesting about horror writing. And this is so fascinating to me because I do not write horror. I don't really read that much horror. I don't really think about the genre that much, but as sort of like a more mainstream literary writer, the idea that horror can teach it. Well, you're saying horror helps us embrace what's good about ourselves. So it's just so fascinating. So yeah, I'd just love to hear you talk more about that.
Well, yeah, I don't write much horror either. I read a lot of it now. I used to read it when I was a kid, and there were more like accessible horror novels, a lot of like modern horror novels seem like very long, or it's like all Stephen King, or it's like a little too gruesome and things like that. So Ligeia is very nice because we get a lot of horror. I mean, we get our fair share of like gruesome stories, and like, we're no strangers to things like that. But we get a sort of psychological and metaphorical horror that really delves deep into like personhood and what it means to do bad things or to be afraid, and which I think is very interesting, especially in like a urban Gothic sort of environment that a lot of our writers do live in, and we of course do live in, because it really helps us tackle like the daily fears that we face in like a modern society where the news is constantly horrifying in and of itself. It, like I said, it helps us embrace like our empathy and the people that we truly care about.
Yeah. So can you give an example of something, because this is really interesting, that the line between sort of like the more gruesome horror, like kind of just gore for gore's sake. I'm sure you see some of those submissions and just kind of like blood and guts kind of stuff, versus something that's really psychologically taught and that may not even have, I'm guessing, like the blood and guts in it, but that has like an element of psychological horror. Can you give an example of a piece that was recently in your magazine that would be like, this is exactly what we want?
Well, okay, I have the magazine up here. There are a couple fiction pieces that I know of, but I can't think of off the top of my head. But there is this one poem that I accepted for our last summer issue, 2021, called "For the Girl Who Raised Herself." And if I could read it,
sure,
would be awesome. It's pretty short. And this is by Chris Blexrud. Her mother sleeps whenever she can, late afternoons on top of the sheets, light pouring in from the windows with the errands left undone. She's like a church in a mine where work and worship join blistered hands, and all the little heads come to bow at the edge of her mattress, softer than anything, where miners still dream even after a cave-in. So I thought that was a very beautiful poem. And it's got an air of uncertainty. And of course, at the very end, with the cave-in imagery, there is a sort of looming sense of death and danger in the background of the poem. And that's sort of what I mean. There is danger in most things that, people do, even if it's just, driving a car to work. There is that sense of risk involved with it. And so I think even the most technologically advanced society still has that sense of horror or unknown behind it, because what if something happens? What if I leave my children, these bowing heads by my bedside, and I can't do anything about it or help them? There is always this sense of fear in the human condition, and we need to accept that and use it as a tool to embrace what is really meaningful in our lives, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can speak to this, but what sort of like writing advice would you give to writing? Because to me, this all sounds really fascinating. So if I were thinking, wow, I kind of want to try this and explore this a little bit more in my own work. Let's say somebody hasn't written horror, they're not that familiar with the genre. What sort of prompts or suggestions might you have?
Well, from what I read and what I'm interested in,
Mhm.
the more contemporary horror, don't be afraid to include modern day, technologies, luxuries, things like that. Because a lot of people, they see horror and they're stuck in like Victorian haunted houses and
Mm.
like trapped with no escape, and there's like a ghost or a monster, and it's that's, which of course is fine, and like you can do that. I can't so much speak to that genre because I don't read enough of it anymore, but don't be afraid to make it modern, because like I said, there are, we face different fears now as people.
Mhm.
And it is, of course, it's very nice as someone who read a lot of, like Victorian literature and like old English uh, history, like very recently. It's always nice to go back to your roots and like the scary stories that used to scare us and are very fun and kitschy and stuff like that. But don't be hindered by your genre. And I
Mhm.
think that's another thing that Ligeia really showed me, is that, and like many small lit mags show me nowadays, is that genre is not so much of a constraint anymore.
Mhm.
There's like slipstream and like hybrid work, and I think that's all so interesting because you can use different mediums and different genres of just writing, even to instill different emotions in your audience. And
Mhm.
I think that's very interesting because we have a very multimedia platform at our fingertips with the internet.
Mhm.
And so don't be afraid to experiment, and don't be afraid to be modern with it, because you will uh, touch your audience even more readily if
Yeah.
they recognize themselves in your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this great essay by Joyce Carol Oates, who is sort of like some people think of her as kind of a Gothic writer. She's
Mm-hmm.
sort of somewhere mainstream, at times Gothic. Sometimes she does
Somewhere
things.
in between, which is
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, but she has this great essay. She talks a lot about Poe in it. It's called The Faith of a Writer. But
Mm-hmm.
she tells writers to just do not be afraid of your dark obsessions, because
Yes.
that's the source of your inspiration. And I think that's very true and very hard for writers to come to terms with. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't just like on a Monday morning like
Mm-hmm.
sit down at your desk and dive deep into your kind of uglier soul and your
You
darkest.
got your coffee, and
Yeah,
you're
it's like,
like,
oh,
all
you
right,
just,
what's my
dropped your
trauma
kid
look
at the
like
school
today?
bus. Yeah. But I think I find what you're saying just really interesting, because I do think that's where the best work comes from, that sort
Mm-hmm.
of confronting those things that you're so afraid of that you can't even talk about them. And there's plenty of that in our contemporary, like you were saying,
Yeah.
just because now we can, if we get stranded on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, maybe we have our cell phones now, so there's a ghost is emerging. But the technology is not going to necessarily save us or help us, and there's
Yeah.
certainly horror there to explore. So yeah, it's just really interesting, this idea that to dive deeper into those things that frighten you.
Mm-hmm.
And that in this magazine, it sounds like there's a home for that kind of work.
Yeah, and I like what you said about Joyce Carol Oates and the obsessions, because we, even on our about page, we say that we are all about the reader's obsessions,
Yeah,
and the things they can't stop thinking about that maybe don't make them happy, or
right.
maybe gnaw at them, but those are the things that I find most need to be talked about, even if
Yeah.
you feel afraid to put them down on paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you think, or I'm curious, what is your sort of position on this idea of like writing as therapy? Because it sounds like this could be very therapeutic, but I think for some people, that's not such a great idea. Like they don't feel
Mm-hmm.
like writing should be therapy, or, I mean, writing can be anything for anyone.
Right. Yeah, it
um,
really depends on the person.
yeah, yeah, but it sounds like, um, I guess, how do you elevate, or how would you suggest that a writer elevate a story from something that's like a diary entry, where it's like, I
Mm-hmm.
can't stop thinking about this terrible thing that happened, or this terrible thing that I'm afraid of happening?
Mm-hmm.
How do you transform that into something like exciting and interesting to somebody else?
Editing. editing, because a lot of like my personal poetry
Mhm.
is really just me writing something as I think it.
Mhm.
And that's why, you know, I'm very sporadic when it comes to my writing, because if I'm not feeling something very intensely, I can't write about it. And I can't always put myself in that space, you know? So what separates just like diary entries, rambling, oh, I'm so very upset about something that happened, is literally just coming back to it and, you know, sprucing it up, like, oh, I could add a metaphor here, or
Mhm.
oh, if I wanted to make this into something publishable, like, you know, maybe the end needs to be the beginning for a little like flair and a little like narrative structure.
Mhm.
I very much believe in, you know, maybe not divine inspiration or anything when it comes to a poem, but there's some sort of spark of inspiration that really leads to, I think, the best poetry. And I'm not, you know, dissing on the grind or anything. I very much believe that hard work and writing something every day pays off, but very much I believe that if you feel something intensely, just write it, come back to it later, and you will have something that will mean something to somebody else.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of even writers who don't write every day are still writing and working in their subconscious and some
You're
levels.
always working.
You're always working. Yeah. And I think
Mhm.
for some people, that discipline of I have to produce 1,000 words a day. Your screen is frozen again. Oh, there we go. Okay. Everything's okay. Yeah, I think for some people that you know the discipline is necessary. Like for me, I need to have that. I think it might also be different for fiction writers because you do
There's so much more to write.
Yeah, and you want to kind of like keep a certain flow going,
Mhm.
but I also think for writers, if you go like 3 weeks without actually putting words on paper and then you sit down and you know that process is going to work for you, then I think that
Yeah.
is also really useful.
Yeah, and I like how it's different for everybody, because everybody has different tips and ideas that they can share with each other, even if they don't have the exact same process.
Right.
Mhm.
So can you tell us, I see on this site you want to see writers' strange obsessions and the Gothic. What is the difference between Gothic and horror?
Horror, I guess, it feels like the slight distinction between like horror and thriller, you know? Horror is more like guts and gore and jumping in your face.
Yeah.
Thriller is more psychological. I think Gothic, you know, it takes from the tradition of Gothic literature, so it doesn't necessarily need to be scary in a very in your face type of way like horror is, but it needs to be ambiguous. I think it needs to make you think. It needs to unsettle you in a way that doesn't necessarily make you think you're going to die, or like make you think that the boogeyman is right outside your door, but in a way that lingers with you, I think. Gothic is very much a, you know, intellectual word and very much a intellectual pursuit, you know, Gothic literature, because it's very much about like what makes man, you know, what makes a person versus Frankenstein's monster, who is not, you know, is not seen as a person, even though it's revealed that he is very tender and very, you know, intellectual himself and very caring. What scares people also makes people think. I think is the distinction.
Right. Okay. So
and
it sounds
that's like, not to disparage horror, because horror also makes you think. It's just in a different way. It's less pondersome and more, I have to, you know, survive now and I'll think later.
Yeah. So it sounds like Gothic might be more of like an existential fear, sort of gets under your skin.
Yeah.
And horror does that too, but I guess maybe a distinction also is that horror tends to be more plot driven. So like I do, obviously everybody thinks of Stephen King, and it's very fast paced, and there is kind of like a more of a structure to that form, where it sounds like Gothic might be a little bit more open-ended to some degree.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That we get a lot of work that's kind of Gothic, and it's very much guy sits in a room, and thinks. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's very true. There's no real plot to it, but
right.
It does.
For
it
better
does
or
make
for worse, there's
compelling
no
narrative.
Yeah. So actually, that was my next question: is what are some tropes that you see a lot of that you kind
Guy
of
sits in a room.
Yeah.
For poetry specifically, there is a lot of confrontation of death. We do get a lot of like funeral poems, and I think people don't have a lot of places to send them. There are a lot of like odes and grief type poems, but those will go off to more esteemed magazines, I suppose, ones that celebrate life and everything. But a lot of the poems that we get celebrate death. You're at a funeral, or you're smoking a cigarette at a wake or whatever.
Right.
Which isn't to say these poems don't celebrate life, because there are snippets of the person's life in the poems, but it really is the poems that we get like that really embrace the grief of it. We get a lot of disaster poems. We haven't gotten a lot of pandemic poems.
I was wondering.
I think that's a little raw.
Yeah.
But we do get a lot of disaster poems. Like recently we published a poem called 2 Days After Hurricane Zeta, about rebuilding after a disaster. A lot of grief, a lot of things like that. It makes it a little difficult to read through the inbox every week, but they're beautiful poems. It's beautiful work.
Yeah.
So I think that helps a lot. It's kind of like a balm. You read it and you are grieving with the speaker, but you are also empathizing with the speaker, and it's like a discussion where they're bearing themselves, and you feel like you are trusted, and you feel more trust in return towards the speaker, because you're sharing something so personal.
Do you have a different or more personal submissions or rejection process because people may be sharing some very dark personal things?
It does depend on the poetry, because we do get a lot of submissions. A couple submission periods ago, the link to our page was posted on like a writer's Facebook group, and we got like 600 poetry submissions.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes it's just very unfeasible to personalize every rejection, but I try to as much as I can, especially if I very much like the poem, or especially if it was very personal. I read all the cover letters, and people like to say, this was a poem, say, inspired by my father's death, or, a tragedy in the family. And I try to respond as personally as I can when I have the time to.
Yeah, that's great.
That's important.
It is important. And I've heard some editors, unfortunately, say they don't do that because they get a negative response from writers when they do that. Have you encountered anything like that, where writers push back and say, screw you, I don't need your pity?
No, I haven't actually. It's been a very nice experience. Everyone has been very kind. I haven't gotten any negative replies to a message like that. Of course, you get your random submissions that are just mean-spirited, but no real like pushback like that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So what are some things that you would want to see more of in submissions? Like, as you envision the journal growing, are there places that you feel like you want to grow into? Are there certain kinds of things you feel like you haven't yet seen?
I've seen a lot. As you can imagine, I've seen a lot of crazy work. I can't, of course, since I haven't seen it yet, I can't think of any areas of expansion. Whatever strange things that the writer wants to send me, please send me, because I'm always ready to explore. We are trying to recruit more Baltimore poets and more Baltimore writers, because shockingly enough, we don't get too many for being a Baltimore-based magazine. And we want to, we're talking about setting up readings in the future at like local bookstores and things like that. And we figure it'd be easier, to host readings if people are in the area. So more Baltimore and Maryland-based writers. and more by POC writers. The horror genre is still very much a white male dominated field, even in, these contemporary times. And we do accept a lot of, by POC submitters, because there's beautiful work and there's so much to be taken from the horrors of the news and the horrors of living in a body that is, unstable to the general public and the majority, a violent majority of people. So we are always looking for more bi POC writers, more women and their experiences, because we still don't get too many, sadly. And of course, I can't speak to, fiction and nonfiction, and I'm sure Sean and Matt have a lot to say about what they want to see in the magazine and where they want to see it go. And I'd be interested to hear that too, actually.
Yeah, I'm interested in how do you, and maybe I can talk to them separately, but maybe you can speak to this, like what does nonfiction horror look like?
Look around you.
Yeah,
I don't, we don't get too many nonfiction submissions in the first place. So we do a lot of reviews there in our nonfiction section of, poetry and like books that come out. So it's a lot of discussing other people's horror and other people's Gothic literature. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of contemporary writing about contemporary topics in our nonfiction section because people need to pathologize in different ways, it's very hard topics that a lot of people don't think it's polite to discuss, like at the dinner table, and so people just don't talk about it.
So you mentioned that you see a lot of crazy submissions. I'm sure you see a lot of dark stuff, a lot of gory stuff. How do you decompress? What is your editorial process like? Do you need to read 3 things and then go for a walk, or how, or is it very pleasurable to you because this is kind of what you like to read? And
I feel like a Facebook moderator.
That's what it actually made me think of, like the screeners who have to get rid of all the dark stuff online.
I do take a lot of walks. Since I have a very walkable neighborhood, I have my little route I take every day. During submission periods, I tend to read lighter works on my own, like for my own personal enjoyment, instead of horror or things like that, just to mix it up a little bit. I have a cat, and he does not like me, and he's very mean to me, but I pet him. So that helps. And I talk about it, if I read something particular, like I don't share the author's personal information, but I will talk to my roommates or my partner and say, I just read something very horrible and I want to talk about it, like beautiful poem. I want to tell you about the structure and how it works and why it works. And that discussion really helps me see like the intellectual side and share it with somebody that will also appreciate it.
And the things that get under your skin the most, are they the things that tend to be the most well written?
It really depends.
Yeah.
We get things that are horrifying and I couldn't imagine ever happen to me, but like they're not as well written maybe sometimes, and like it's not as effective, I guess.
Right.
But if it really gets under my skin and I can't stop thinking about it, that's usually a sign to me that it is well written.
Yeah, I was wondering, because it seems like the stuff, like I imagine there's a certain kind of story or a certain kind of poem that you see that is just, it gets under your skin. It's just so blunt. And just really violent, and it can be disturbing and it's upsetting and bothersome, but it's almost bothersome that the fact that somebody wrote it is bothersome. Or decided to write it in this particular way, more than actually it being like, wow, this really made me think of life in a different way or imagine my body in a different way.
One good example of the dichotomy of it being getting under my skin because it's well written and getting under my skin just because it's gross is like we get a lot of people's family trauma. And
yeah.
that's something that, of course, sits with everybody in some way. And so, there's some that's just obviously, trauma for trauma's sake and exploiting, and of course, there are a lot of inexperienced writers that are just trying to write about a trauma, but it comes off as shocking because, sometimes they're inexperienced and they don't know exactly what's acceptable to, when it's acceptable to stop talking sometimes. And so I get a lot of like very detailed things and I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've pried into your life,
Right.
But yeah, on the flip side of that, we get a lot of stuff that is, family trauma, but very discreet. So it's less in your face and more like not a hint of, I don't want to discourage people from talking openly. It's a very touchy subject because I want to hear what you have to say about these issues and everything, but I don't want you to use your experience as shock value.
Right.
Right. So we do get a lot of very well written pieces that do deal with family trauma in a very blunt way, and they do say what they mean, but they're usually threaded through with bits of reprise. They have moments of artistry that maybe don't make you reflect on life or like the bigger picture of it, but moments of clarity, I think, in a very busy mind that's so worried about survival and how to process these heavy emotions. And I think that's important, not only for the reader and the audience, because that doesn't matter when you're writing for therapy or to get something off your chest. I think that's also very important for the writer, because focusing so much on your trauma and how it broke you down is fine, but I think at some point you need to try to address the pain and how you can help internalize and maybe heal. Because writing personally for me, I think, is a balm in a way. It's a way to help you express in a safe place and heal in a safe place without worry about people prodding at you or making fun of your very deep feelings. Because you don't always need to submit. You don't always need to publish. You can keep it just for yourself. And even if it's beautiful and the best thing you've ever written, you never need to share your writing if it's too hard to.
Yeah. What sort of responses have you gotten to the work that you publish?
People generally like it. I mean, I hang around a crowd that doesn't really read very much in my day-to-day life, because I have a lot of and I'm not generalizing or anything, but I have a lot of musicians, and I'm not deep within the literary community in Baltimore yet. So I point them into the direction of the magazine, like, hey, there's a new issue out, you should maybe take a look. And they have such overwhelmingly positive responses. And I'm like, they're my friends, they're hyping me up or whatever. But it's very nice to see people that don't even usually read for pleasure get really into it and talk to me about it and say like, well, what do you think about this story, and what do you think about this story, about this poem, and what makes it work? What makes me feel this way about this that's different from anything I've read before. And I think that's incredible.
Yeah. It seems like that would be one advantage of the form, is that it can reach people who maybe don't necessarily read that much. I mean, if something has that element of existential dread and speaks to like the horribleness of the horrors of our time, not horribleness, but just the many fears of our time. I mean, I think, if it's well done, somebody who's not a literary person will likely be pulled into it.
Yeah. And I like that, because it really sparks discussion.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Are there other literary magazines that you sort of consider like brother or sister journals?
Let's see. There's a few on Twitter. There's a small niche like horror Gothic community on Twitter of literary journals. Things like, oh god, now I have to pull up my Twitter. Things like Expat and places like that. I like any these aren't quite like sister magazines or anything, but like things like Split Lip and places like that do more pop culture are usually interesting because they delve into some of the same topics as we do, because there's of course a lot of murder, a lot of intrigue, a lot of true crime that people are interested in nowadays. So places like that I really respect. They're not quite the same, but they have a similar vibe. Places like Opia are very cool.
Okay.
Let's see who else is on here. I got a little list. But yeah, it's a very small community though. Like Vamp Cat is another one, but these are tiny magazines and I love them.
Yeah.
Because it makes such a insular community where we can easily discuss ideas and we feel very friendly with the other editors, and which is very useful because as a literary magazine that wants to expand and maybe one day do like an anthology edition or a print edition, it's very nice to share contact information for like tools that we can use to get there with these other small presses and small magazines that are in our field. So yeah.
So you guys are only open for submissions for 1 month, is that correct? Is that just to keep the workload manageable?
Yes. Because since we are only a 3-person team and we pretty much Sean and Matt share the prose, the fiction and nonfiction sections, but we pretty much all have the same amount of work. We tend to keep it short because anything that we get will be, you know, an uphill battle to get through.
Yeah.
But that being said, in that short amount of time, we do get a very high caliber of work, which is why we think it's worth keeping the window short.
That's great. Yeah. And so then that work, how many times a year do you guys publish?
4.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's enough
quarterly.
work to carry you through 4 issues. Wow. Okay. That's great. And how, I guess it's 2 short stories per issue and 3 poems, or?
No, that's actually 5 on the 5th. I just recently did a collaboration with them where they released their first poetry issue. So they did 2 prose pieces and 3 poems. But we don't have a hard and fast cap. Okay. And I find that it grows every issue. I like to hover around 15 poets, not poems, 15 poets. Okay. And we're usually at like, I don't know, this issue is bigger. It looks like around 15 fiction pieces or fiction writers, because we post a lot of flash fiction. So some people will have 2 stories to a page. Okay.
And will you be running any contests?
We are thinking about running contests in the future. We have a couple judges maybe lined up. We just need to sort out the logistics. So keep an eye out for that.
So for somebody who's watching this and is really intrigued by this genre, as I suddenly am, like really interested in just opening up new possibilities. I think for, you know, a writer in any genre, again, like if you're writing mainstream or more like literary fiction, the idea of exploring your darker side and your obsession, like really embracing the thing that is really scary, can only lend itself to better writing. So can you just sort of off the top of your head give some authors that somebody could explore to sort of dig into the genre a little bit more, and of course to read your magazine?
Of course. Top of the list, Ligeia magazine. Okay, well, let's see. Well, most of the reading I do in this genre, in this like micro genre, is for Ligeia, but a lot of my graduate level reading list at Towson University really delves into those obsessions, because bless my teachers, bless my professors, Jeannie Benasco and Leslie Harrison, they have like molded me into the writer I've become, and that's partially through the reading, of course. So there's Sophia Shalmiev's Mother Winter is a fantastic memoir that talks about, you know, her trauma with her negligent mother and her absent father, and so there's a lot of obsession to delve into there, because Sophia literally tries to find her mom again after so many years of not having any contact with her, and it leads her down this crazy traveling rabbit hole where she really delves into herself and what would what it means to be a good mother, of course, having her own children. So she's a great author when it comes to obsession. And I'm a big fan of Ada Limon. She is who I model my poetry after. It's not so much horror, but it does very much talk about like contemporary issues and the banalities of the day-to-day and how we manage through those. Let's see, who else? Who do I have? I have my shelves like right here and right here. I love Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House.
Okay.
That's a beautiful memoir. Most of these suggestions are going to be memoirs. And what do I have? One more. Oh, Miriam Gerba's Mean. Miriam Gerba, Mean. And I think that actually just got picked up to be made into a TV show or a limited series. So that's very exciting.
Yeah.
So if you want dark obsessions or dealing with past trauma, those are definitely some books to read.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So what else is on the horizon for you guys? You have, is your latest issue up now or is it coming out soon?
Yes, our latest issue came up or got posted on the 31st or on the 30th, Halloween weekend.
Makes sense.
We don't have a new issue scheduled just yet, but that'll probably come out early January because that's the usual time frame for that. And submissions will probably open in December. Because that's the usual time.
Oh, I thought, so it looked like on the site, the submissions were open in September. Is that not?
That needs to be updated because that was our last submission window. Yeah.
Oh, so you have.
I'll get on Sean for that.
Is it separate? Do you have multiple submission windows?
Yeah, we have multiple submission windows. We usually publish in, say, January, April, July, September. Yeah, and then start over again. Yeah, so about a month before is the submission window.
Okay. I thought from the site it was just September and that those submissions carried for all 4 issues for the year, but that's really good to know. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And so where can people find you? Ligeia.com, is that?
Yeah, they can find us at ligeiamagazine.com and they can find us on Twitter at Ligeia Mag. I think. Yeah, Ligeia Mag. And same thing on Instagram, Ligeia Mag.
Okay. Not on Facebook or
No Facebook.
Okay.
Twitter is where you'll get most updates when it comes to submission windows or issues dropping. Or any contests that we have in the future.
Yeah, so everybody should go to the site, check out the latest issue, read it, and then look for the submissions window in December. And brush up on your Gothic and your horror work. This is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.